The courtroom was heavy with silence as 5-year-old Lily Lawson stepped through the tall wooden doors, her small fingers wrapped tightly around the leash of Titan, a German shepherd with a deep, jagged scar along his side. Every pair of eyes followed the little girl as she slowly made her way toward the witness stand, her tiny frame stiff with tension yet unwavering. Judge Malcolm Hayes, a seasoned veteran of the legal system, leaned forward, studying her intently. He knew that the outcome of this case rested on her delicate shoulders. Lily was the only witness to a crime that could put a dangerous man behind bars for life. But there was a complication. Since the attack, she hadn't spoken a single word. Across the courtroom, the defendant, Gregory Vale, sat at the defense table, a man in his mid-40s, with an unassuming, clean-cut appearance. He exuded an air of forced calm. His defense was strong. No physical evidence, no confession, and a traumatized child who couldn't testify. His lawyer had already prepared a strategy to dismiss her as an unreliable witness. But then, something unexpected happened. As Lily climbed into the witness chair, her wide green eyes met Vale's. Her small hand trembled slightly before making a subtle movement, a gesture so discreet most wouldn't have noticed. But two beings in the room did, Titan and Judge Hayes. Titan's reaction was instant. The moment Lily's fingers twitched in that quiet plea for help, his ears snapped forward, his muscular frame tensed, coiled like a spring. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest, a sound of warning, of recognition. His piercing brown eyes locked onto Vale with an intensity that sent a wave of unease through the room. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. This was more than a trained service dog reacting to his handler's distress. This was something deeper, something primal. Judge Hayes brought down his gavel sharply, the sound cracking like thunder through the courtroom. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice unusually firm. The prosecutor, Olivia Barnes, shot him a questioning look, but he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, his eyes flickered toward Lily, who clung to Titan like a lifeline. Something had just happened, something significant, and he needed to understand what it meant before proceeding any further. Outside in the hallway, Lily knelt beside Titan, her small hands buried in his fur. Her mother, Rachel Lawson, crouched next to her, smoothing the child's golden curls with trembling fingers. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered. Lily didn't respond, but her grip on Titan tightened. Nearby, Detective Jack Monroe observed the scene with a hardened expression. A veteran FBI investigator, Monroe had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him that Titan had just uncovered something crucial. He stepped closer to Judge Hayes. "That dog just reacted like he recognized Vale," Monroe murmured. "And if he does, we need to figure out why." Meanwhile, in the defense's private room, Gregory Vale sat across from his attorney, Michael Graves. The moment the door shut behind them, the calm facade Vale had worn throughout the trial cracked. His fingers drummed restlessly against the table. "The girl hasn't spoken, but the dog," Vale muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Graves frowned. "What?" Vale forced a tight smile. "Nothing," he said quickly, but his mind was already racing. He hadn't considered the dog as a problem. Now he realized Titan could be the key to unraveling everything. As the recess ended, Judge Hayes straightened his robes and took a deep breath. He didn't believe in coincidences. And right now, something told him that Titan had just given them the most critical clue in the entire trial. Before the silence of the courtroom, before the nightmares that stole her voice, Lily Lawson had been a vibrant, talkative child. At 5 years old, she filled rooms with stories, her bright green eyes gleaming with curiosity and mischief. She adored fairy tales, stuffed animals, and the way her mother read bedtime stories in different voices. She had never known fear until that fateful afternoon. It had been a perfect spring day. The scent of blooming flowers drifted through the air, and the warm sun painted golden streaks across the backyard. Rachel Lawson had been watching Lily from the kitchen window, smiling as her daughter twirled in the yard, her pink dress flaring like a dancer's. Then the phone rang. It was Rachel's sister, calling from out of state. She stepped inside for what she thought would be a quick conversation. 4 minutes. That's all it took. When she returned to the yard, the gate was ajar. A wave of cold terror shot through her veins. Her breath hitched as her eyes frantically searched for Lily. She was still there, but she wasn't alone. A black van idled near the curb, its side door slightly open. A man knelt beside Lily, his expression unnervingly warm. "I have puppies in my van," he was saying, his voice smooth, practiced. "Special ones. They need a little girl to take care of them. Would you like to see?" Rachel's world slowed. Her instincts screamed before her mind could process what was happening. Her voice cut through the air. "Lily?" The man's head snapped up. His smile vanished, replaced by something sharp and calculating. In an instant, he grabbed Lily's arm. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She only stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, frozen in place by a fear so deep it rendered her silent. Across the street, Martha Jenkins, a retired nurse, was walking her terrier when she saw everything unfold. Her voice, worn with age but strong with conviction, rang out. "Hey, get away from that child!" The man hesitated. His grip loosened, just for a fraction of a second. It was all Lily needed. She yanked her arm free and bolted toward her mother. Rachel scooped her up just as the van's engine roared. Tires screeched against the pavement as the vehicle sped away, leaving black streaks on the road. Rachel clutched Lily against her chest, her heart pounding in her ribs. But Lily didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She only buried her face in her mother's shoulder and trembled. The police arrived within minutes. Detective Munro, seasoned in child abduction cases, took control of the scene. His sharp brown eyes flickered with recognition as he studied the little girl. "She fits the pattern," Munro murmured. 4 other children have gone missing in the last 18 months. Same approach, same van. Agent Lisa Grant, his partner, knelt beside Lily. "Sweetheart, do you remember what the man looked like?" Silence. Rachel smoothed Lily's hair, voice barely above a whisper. "Honey, it's okay. You're safe now. Can you tell them what he looked like?" Lily gripped her mother's sweater tightly, but she didn't speak. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, shutting her voice off completely. Over the following days, Lily withdrew further into herself. The once bubbly girl who filled the house with laughter now spent her days curled up in silence. She flinched at the sound of passing cars and refused to step outside. The nights were worse. Rachel and her husband, Daniel, woke up to find their daughter thrashing in her sleep, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She never screamed, never made a sound. Desperate, Rachel sought help from specialists. Child psychologists, trauma counselors, everyone had a different approach, but none could bring Lily back from the place she had retreated. Then, Dr. Laura Bennett, a therapist specializing in animal-assisted recovery, suggested something unconventional. "A therapy dog," she said, watching Lily with gentle eyes. "Not just any dog. A protector. A companion who can sense what she needs, even when she can't say it." That's how they found Titan. Rachel had been skeptical at first. Titan wasn't a gentle-looking therapy dog. He was a retired K-9, a large, powerful German shepherd with a thick coat of black and tan fur. His most striking feature was the jagged scar along his side, a wound from his years of service. But when Lily met Titan for the first time, something changed. It wasn't immediate. She didn't rush to him or speak, but she didn't run away either. She simply stood there, staring, as the dog sat calmly before her. Laura placed a hand on Titan's back. "He won't move unless you want him to," she told Lily. "He's waiting for you to be ready." For long moments, Lily didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, she reached out a trembling hand. Her tiny fingers brushed against Titan's fur. He didn't react, just remained steady and solid beneath her touch. A breath Rachel hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips. That night, for the first time since the incident, Lily didn't wake up in terror. And soon an unbreakable bond formed between the little girl and the former K-9. Where Lily went, Titan followed. When fear threatened to consume her, she gripped his fur and found strength in his presence. When nightmares came, she curled against him, his steady heartbeat anchoring her. She still didn't speak, but she was healing. Then the trial began. Rachel had fought to keep Lily out of the courtroom, but the prosecution needed her testimony. Titan was granted permission to accompany her under the argument that he was a vital part of her recovery. No one could have anticipated just how important he would become. Back in the courtroom, Judge Hayes studied Lily and Titan with narrowed eyes. He had spent years on the bench, seen countless trials, but he had never witnessed anything like this. "Miss Barnes," he addressed the prosecutor, "what is the relevance of the child's signal to the dog?" Barnes hesitated only a moment before responding. "Your Honor, Titan is a highly trained former K-9. His reactions aren't arbitrary. He has been conditioned to recognize specific commands and signals, particularly in high-stress situations." The defense attorney Graves scoffed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is absurd. We are assigning human-like reasoning to an animal. A dog cannot testify." Judge Hayes ignored him, his gaze fixed on Titan, who remained locked onto Vale. The dog's entire body was coiled, tense, as if recognizing something no one else could perceive. "Miss Lawson," Barnes said gently, turning back to Lily, "would you feel comfortable showing Titan the signal again?" Lily's grip on the leash tightened. For a moment, it seemed she wouldn't respond. Then ever so slightly, her fingers moved in that same subtle way. Titan's reaction was immediate. His ears flattened slightly, his tail stiffened, and another deep, rumbling growl echoed through the silent room. Vale shifted uncomfortably. Barnes turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the child never spoke of the attack. But Titan recognizes something he was trained to detect. His reaction is not one of distress, but of identification." Judge Hayes steepled his fingers, considering. Finally, he turned to the defense. "Mr. Graves, has your client ever encountered this dog before?" Graves frowned. "No, Your Honor." But Vale's face had paled. His fingers, which had been drumming idly on the table earlier, were now curled into a tight fist. Judge Hayes caught the reaction. "Mr. Vale," he said sharply, "I'm asking you directly, have you ever been in contact with this dog?" Vale swallowed hard. "Number I? I don't see how this is relevant." Judge Hayes turned to Barnes. "Miss Barnes, do we have records of Titan's previous assignments?" Barnes nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Titan was active in several child abduction cases before his retirement." A cold weight settled over the courtroom. "I'd like to request a recess," Barnes said, "to cross-check Titan's deployment history with known locations related to the defendant." Graves jumped to his feet. "This is a circus! You can't cross-examine a dog!" Judge Hayes remained unmoved. "The request is granted. This court will reconvene in 2 hours." As soon as the gavel struck, murmurs exploded through the room. But Vale, for the first time since the trial began, he looked genuinely afraid. Outside, Barnes, Monroe, and Rachel huddled around a laptop, scanning Titan's old case records. The former K-9 had been involved in various investigations, including missing persons cases. Then they found it. 3 years prior, Titan had been part of a raid on an illegal trafficking ring. Several children had been recovered from a basement in a remote cabin. The location? A property registered under a shell company, one now tied directly to Vale. Monroe sucked in a breath. Titan doesn't just recognize Vale, he remembers him. Rachel felt her knees go weak. "That means—" Barnes exhaled sharply. "That means this isn't the first time Vale has taken a child." A tense silence fell over the group. Then Monroe straightened. "We need to get back in there," he said, "because if Titan remembers him, then somewhere there may be other children who haven't come home yet." And just like that, the weight of the trial shifted. For the first time, the monster hiding in plain sight was finally about to be unmasked. Back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers rippled through the gallery as people speculated about what Titan's reaction could mean. The judge had called for a recess, but when they reconvened, there was an air of quiet intensity. Something had changed. Gregory Vale was no longer the smug, composed man he had been at the start of the trial. He sat rigidly at the defense table, his hands clenched together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Barnes rose from her seat, a file in hand, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but sharp, "we've uncovered new information directly relevant to this case." In 2019, Titan was involved in a major FBI operation to recover kidnapped children from a property linked to a criminal trafficking ring. That property, as we now know, was registered under an alias used by the defendant. A shocked murmur filled the courtroom. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Are you saying that the defendant has a prior history of involvement in abductions?" Barnes nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, and more importantly, Titan was there. That's why he reacted so strongly to Mr. Vale today." Graves, the defense attorney, shot up from his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. This is purely speculative. There is no evidence linking my client to that case beyond the property record, and there was never an arrest made at the time." Barnes turned to face him, her expression cold. "That's because the person running that operation disappeared before law enforcement could capture him. He vanished without a trace, until now." A hush fell over the room. Judge Hayes steepled his fingers. "Miss Barnes, do you have proof beyond the property connection?" "We're working on it, Your Honor," Barnes admitted. "But I request that the court allow us time to retrieve official FBI records linking Vale to that location. The presence of the child recovered there should be enough to warrant further investigation." Judge Hayes turned to Graves. "Mr. Graves?" Graves clenched his jaw. "This is a distraction. My client is here for a single alleged crime, not past accusations that were never proven." Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair. "I'll allow it. The prosecution has until tomorrow morning to provide further documentation. Court is adjourned until then." The gavel struck, but no one in the courtroom moved right away. The weight of what had just been revealed settled over the room like a thick fog. Outside the courthouse, Barnes, Monroe, and Rachel huddled together, urgency in their movements. "We need to get that file now," Barnes said, already pulling out her phone. Monroe nodded. "I have contacts in the bureau who can expedite the records." Rachel, still gripping Lily's hand tightly, looked down at Titan. The dog sat still, alert, his ears twitching at every sound. He hadn't let his focus waver since the trial began. Lily, silent as always, lowered herself next to Titan, burying her face in his fur. Rachel swallowed hard. "He remembers. He knows what that man did." Monroe exhaled. "Yeah, and now we just need the proof to put him away for good." That night, while the prosecution worked on obtaining the missing FBI files, Vale sat in his holding cell, his knee bouncing anxiously. He had always been careful. He had always stayed one step ahead. But he had made a mistake. Not with Lily, he had almost gotten away with that, but he never accounted for the dog. Titan had been there that night, years ago. Vale hadn't seen the animal in the chaos of the raid, but now, as he replayed the moment in the courtroom when the dog had locked onto him, he realized Titan had known him before he even saw his face. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He needed to think. He needed an escape plan. But for the first time, there wasn't one. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The media had caught wind of the case's sudden twist, and the seats were filled with reporters eager to hear the latest revelation. When Judge Hayes took his seat, he wasted no time. "Miss Barnes, do you have the evidence you requested additional time for?" Barnes stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned to the bailiff, who handed a thick file to the judge. "These are the official FBI case reports from the 2019 raid. They include Titan's involvement and the descriptions given by some of the recovered children." She paused, then took a breath before delivering the final blow. "One of the children identified a man involved in their captivity. He was never caught, but their description matches Mr. Vale." A stunned silence filled the room. Judge Hayes scanned the file. Then he looked up, his gaze sharp as steel. "Mr. Vale, do you have anything to say about these allegations?" Vale's face was ashen. For the first time, his mask had cracked beyond repair. He started, but no words followed. Barnes stepped forward. "Your Honor, given this new evidence, I move to have Mr. Vale remanded without bail pending further investigation into his connection to the trafficking ring." Graves shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." Denied. Judge Hayes cut him off. "Mr. Vale will remain in custody. We will resume trial proceedings after a full investigation is completed." The gavel came down with finality. Rachel held Lily tightly outside the courthouse as reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed, voices shouted, but all Rachel cared about was the way her daughter was clinging to her. Lily still hadn't spoken, but Rachel could feel something different. There was no more trembling, no more shrinking away from the world. And then, just as Rachel knelt down to adjust Lily's coat, her daughter turned to Titan, placed her hands on either side of his face, and whispered, "Good boy." Rachel gasped. Her eyes filled with tears. "Lily?" Lily blinked up at her, as if surprised by her own voice, but then she nodded, pressing her forehead against Titan's. Rachel couldn't stop the sob that escaped her lips. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight. Titan sat beside them, silent, ever watchful. He had done his job, and because of him, justice would finally be served. The courtroom had transformed overnight. What was once a straightforward child abduction case had now cracked open something much larger, something far more sinister. The media had seized onto the new allegations, broadcasting theories that Gregory Vale was not just a kidnapper, but possibly a key figure in a child trafficking ring that had been operating for years. Inside the prosecutor's office, Barnes and Monroe were already in motion, sifting through reports, digging into connections. Monroe tapped his fingers against a file on the desk, his jaw tight. "This guy didn't just wake up one day and decide to take Lily. He's been doing this a long time." Barnes nodded. "And now we have something we didn't before, a living witness. One of the children rescued from that 2019 raid gave a description that fits Vale, but we need more. If we can prove Vale was involved in multiple cases, we can bury him." Monroe exhaled. "What about Lily?" Barnes hesitated. "She's already done more than enough." The detective shook his head. "She doesn't need to testify any more than she already has. But that dog? Titan just might be our missing piece." 2 hours later, they were back in the courtroom. Vale sat stiffly at the defense table, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The confidence he once displayed had been shattered. Judge Hayes turned to Barnes. "Miss Barnes, you may present your next motion." Barnes stood, holding a new file in her hands. "Your Honor, in addition to the case at hand, the prosecution has evidence linking Mr. Vale to an active human trafficking investigation. We have secured testimony from a survivor who remembers his face." She turned toward the defendant. "Mr. Vale, you didn't just try to take Lily Lawson. You have done this before. The difference is, this time, you made a mistake." The room was so silent, you could hear the faintest rustle of paper. Then Barnes walked over to Titan, who sat patiently beside Lily and Rachel. She crouched in front of the dog, reaching into her folder. She pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, an old surveillance image taken during the FBI raid years ago. It showed a masked figure, only partially visible, leading a young girl toward a van. Barnes held the photograph up for the judge to see. This was taken at the scene of the 2019 child recovery raid. We believe the man in this photo is Gregory Vale, and so does Titan. She turned to Lily. Sweetheart, can you show Titan the signal one more time? Lily hesitated, looking at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Then, ever so slightly, she moved her fingers. Titan's body went rigid, his ears perked, his muscles coiling like a spring, his deep brown eyes locking onto Vale. Then came the growl. Low, rumbling, a sound that sent chills down every spine in the courtroom. Vale flinched, his breathing growing rapid. Barnes didn't look away. Your Honor, this reaction isn't random. Titan was on that raid. He recognizes Vale. Judge Hayes looked down at the defense table. Mr. Vale, would you like to respond? Vale's fingers clenched around the table edge. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. Then, just when it seemed like he might try to deny it, he made a fatal mistake. His eyes flickered, not toward Barnes, not toward the judge, but toward Titan. And in that split second, his expression changed. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Barnes saw it. Monroe saw it. So did the jury. Judge Hayes exhaled, then looked toward Graves. Mr. Graves, I suggest you speak to your client, because if the prosecution's investigation proves correct, we're looking at far more than an abduction charge. Graves, pale-faced, whispered something to Vale. The two men exchanged tense words, their conversation so low no one else could hear. Then Graves straightened, his mouth a thin line. Your Honor, my client would like to speak privately with the prosecution. Barnes's eyebrows lifted slightly. We're listening. Judge Hayes nodded. Court is adjourned for recess. The moment the gavel struck, a frenzy of whispers filled the courtroom, but Barnes, Monroe, and Vale were already being led into a private chamber. Inside the small, dimly lit room, Vale sat across from Barnes and Monroe, his usual air of control completely gone. Monroe folded his arms. So, you're ready to talk? Vale exhaled shakily. I want a deal. Barnes scoffed. You're in no position for a deal. Vale's jaw tensed. I can give you names. That got their attention. Barnes narrowed her eyes. Names of who? Vale hesitated. Then he swallowed hard. The others, the ones still out there. Monroe leaned forward, voice dangerously low. Are you telling me there are more kids? Vale nodded once. The air in the room shifted. Barnes exchanged a look with Monroe. If Vale was telling the truth, this case was about to get much bigger. She turned back to him. You give us everything, names, locations, people involved. And in return? Vale's voice was quiet, desperate. No death penalty. Barnes's stomach twisted. She hated the idea of letting this man live out the rest of his years in a prison cell instead of facing the ultimate justice. But if it meant saving more children? She set her jaw. We'll consider it, but you talk first. And for the first time since his arrest, Gregory Vale finally told the truth. Days later, in a hidden basement beneath an abandoned farmhouse, a team of FBI agents uncovered what would become one of the biggest criminal investigations in years. 7 children, scared, malnourished, but alive. Titan was there. The moment they found the children, he lay beside them, pressing his warm body against each one, letting them feel safe. When Monroe called Rachel Lawson that night to tell her the news, she wept, because Lily's silence, Titan's instincts, and a courtroom full of people who refused to ignore the truth had done more than put a monster away. They had saved lives. 3 weeks after the trial, Rachel sat with Lily on their front porch. The world outside had moved on. Headlines had shifted to new scandals, new cases. But for their family, things would never be the same. Lily still didn't talk much, but she was healing. And then, on a quiet spring afternoon, as Titan lay beside her, she whispered 3 little words. "I'm okay now." Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "And Titan?" He simply leaned into Lily's touch, the way he always had. Because he had done what he was meant to do. He had protected her. He had listened when no one else could. And in the end, he had helped her find her voice again.